Our second speaker tonight is a Montreal favorite, Mr. Ethan Song. Independent and determined, Ethan has launched and collaborated on an array of creative and entrepreneurial endeavors. As co-founder, CEO, and creative director of menswear retailer Frank&Oak, as we all know, Ethan enhances everything customer-facing, including the product, marketing campaigns, and online shopping experience. His vision of creating a simple and innovative company at the nexus of fashion, technology, and retail makes him an inspiration to his team and to all of us here. Originally from China, Ethan has traveled and worked on most continents, including more pronounced stints in Shanghai, Paris, and Vancouver. He co-founded Frank&Oak to revolutionize the traditional retail model and offer men the simplest way to shop online. Ethan's entrepreneurial spirit and passion for both the arts and sciences make him a successful driving force behind the innovative brand. Please welcome Ethan Song.
Well, I think since you stole my intro, I'm gonna have to figure something new out. So thanks for having me. My name's Ethan, CEO and co-founder of Frank&Oak. Really happy to be here. Actually, really honored to be here. I typically get invited to speak at like startup, tech conferences that are not nearly as fancy, where the chairs are not as fancy as this conference. So I'm happy actually that we're invited at this conference to talk about design, how we work on ideas and bring products to market. So one thing that's interesting about this conference is the fact that if I would have known that this room was this fancy and that the slides before my presentation were going to be this fancy, I would have made better slides, right? So that's like one of the first thing I would have done better. But I think that's actually what is the point of my presentation, actually, is the fact that my slides are not very fancy. And if you come to the Frank&Oak office, it's also not very fancy, and it's part of our culture, actually. And what is that culture? I mean, I think that, we started Frank&Oak about 2.5 years ago. Actually, who knows about Frank&Oak here? Okay, so I won't focus too much on that, but we started the company about 2.5 years ago. It was launched in February 2012. So it's been, we're going to be almost 3 years basically by next year. And the actual website and the actual product and the labels and the logo, all that was designed in about like 3 to 4 weeks, right? So what's interesting about that is that we never really did any kind of study or thinking or even brainstorming about the name. We just had to go with whatever we had. In the same way that I just have to go with these slides because I'm already here, so it's too late to change them, right? But that speaks about something, right? I think that what's interesting about that is that what I realized is that in some ways, after we launched, it's only been 2.5 years, right? So the company grew really rapidly, so we never really had the time to actually go back to some of these important processes to better figure out what are your brand values, right? What are your design value? What are you trying to achieve with your product? We actually didn't have that much time to think about these things. And although I think there's tremendous value in doing so, I actually feel like the way we approached building our business, which is being agile, not really knowing what is right or what is wrong until we put it on the market, has been a big part of what has made Frank&Oak successful in this day and age. So what I will actually talk about today is not so much how you come up with ideas, but so much more about when you do have the ideas, how do you put them on the market and how do you test? How do you get feedback from customers? And it doesn't matter whether it's a shirt, an application, or a design. In some ways, all of these are products and it's all design. And in the end, it has to connect with a customer, a user, or a member. So how do we go about making that better? And I think that at Frank&Oak, we've done thousands of things in the last like 2.5 years. And out of those, at least 500 were wrong, right? But we've learned and we've progressed and we've made it better so fast and so effectively that the customer probably doesn't even know that we made those mistakes. And I think that's a big part of what made us successful. So I'm just gonna start with this pretty simple slide about innovation, and I always like to start with. So when you're working on a product or an idea and trying to improve that, right? Like iteration, or for developers, what you could call A/B testing, will give you these like small incremental changes in your product or in your design. what we try to strive for is we assume we can do that, right? The home run, what everyone in the business of any businesses want to do is to find that gap. Because as you can see, no matter how good you are iterating on your product, if the line continues that way, you will still never be as good as that other guy. And I think that if you guys think about all the products that you love, whether it's like an iPhone or whatever that you're using, it's often a product that comes on the market that's so much above everything else that there's no point talking about all these other products, and they will never get as good as this product unless they find that point, that catalyst that jumps them ahead and jumps into the next curve, right? So another way of looking at this chart from a technology standpoint or from a demographic standpoint is, where is that break in the market? Where is that break in technology where all of a sudden everyone is working on search and I'm working on social? Where is that break where everyone's focused on delivering on this kind of product for the customer, but we realize that really the customer wants this product? And it doesn't even matter how good their product is, we'll do so much better, right? So I find this is a good way to start a conversation as you go through deciding what is the right thing to do in terms of product and design. So I think one thing that's interesting is, in some ways, we're not an agency, right? So we design a product and we put a product out on the market. People always say, well, how do you know that it's gonna work out? Like, you're gonna go and like spend all this time designing this application or this feature or this shirt, right? How do you know that it's gonna sell, or how do you know that a customer will connect with it? We don't. You never know for sure, and that's why we love it so much. That's the whole point with consumer-oriented, consumer interfaces, that you just can't predict it. But there are strategies that you can use to be better and to improve faster. And I'll share with you guys sort of 8 strategies that we use at Frank&Oak that we didn't have when we first started, but now that we've been in the business for a few years, we realize those are actually really important strategies for us, right? So the first one, which is interesting, is that we try to focus the least amount of time actually on the product. What we try to focus on is more on what are we trying to achieve? What is the actual vision of our product? What is the overarching idea when we're trying to think about a product, right? So when you focus on where you are and where you go, the route may change, but you're kind of always working on the same product. So one of the things that some of you guys probably know, if you've seen me speak before, is that Frank&Oak actually did not start as Frank&Oak, right? We started a custom shirting company before called Moda Suite. And in some ways, when people ask me, well, what was that breaking point for you guys? Like, why did you decide to change business? Why did you guys move on to this design, this branding? And is that what made it successful? I often say that it's not really the case, because when we first started, we wanted to create a retail company that was in between the arts and technology, that would become an advisor, a catalyst in the lives of our customers. Our goal today, in some ways, is the same goal. And yet the product is so different. And I think that what was interesting with that is that people see that, they say that, oh, Frank&Oak pivoted, right? We've changed strategy. We've changed the way we did things. The reality is our vision always stayed the same. And that's the reason why when we were working on Moda Suite, it was just another stepping stone to getting to point B. So I think that whenever you guys are thinking about designing a product, focus less on the actual action, but more so on where do you want to go, and have the confidence that through successes and failures, you will slowly move towards that. And I think this is a good strategy when you think about especially long-term projects. The second aspect, which is a classic agency type statement, which is the customer does not know what he wants, right? So Steve Jobs said that, everyone knows that Steve Jobs said that. But what's interesting is that whenever I speak to designers or whenever I speak to my team, I always say, well, fine, the customer does not know what he wants, but I don't think you do either, right? So then who knows, right? Well, how do you get to know what the customer wants? And I'll give you guys a non-intuitive answer to this point, which is actually not very popular with people that are very creative like us, right? Which is the fact that studying products that are out on the market is the best way to know what the customer wants and what the customer does not want, right? So if we go back to our old friend Steve Jobs, he says that the customer does not know what he wants, but he always puts a product out on the market after there's already been a few iterations of that product on the market. And the reason why he does that is because when you ask a customer, the customer will not know exactly what he wants because he can't describe what he hasn't seen or what he hasn't experienced. But if you see a customer interacting with something that's already on the market, you are getting so much more pointed information about what's right and what's wrong. So actually, the one thing that I feel is very important, and I think it's sort of sometimes underrated, is you can get a lot of information by looking at what's out in the market, not necessarily from who's doing better, but what are the functionalities, what exists, what's being used, what is essential to that, whatever app or whatever product you're making, and using that to kind of help you guys make better decisions on products. So number 3 is about planning. We never really had a plan at our company, and I think it's probably problematic at times. This whole idea of like, and this is obviously very startup-y, which is to not have a plan and just go for it. It's actually very hard to do, right? And the reason why I'm not a big fan of having a plan is not because like it's cool and we're pirates, right? But more so, it's because big companies have plans. Big companies have 3-year strategies. Big companies have like all these like slides and reports, or they don't have them, but they hire consultants to do them. And what happens with that is that when you do have a plan, you're basically getting your team and your whole company to actually deliver on the plan. Okay, so once again, if you talk to a big company person, they'll say, well, that's great, they deliver on the plan, we're successful. You are not, because your goal is not to deliver on a plan. Your goal is to deliver on whatever the vision is for your product, right? So you may deliver on a plan that's the wrong plan. And you will measure success based on you having delivered on the plan within the timeline and budget that you've done it, but really, you never really wanted to be there in the first place, right? So what I say is, how do you achieve the in-between having no plan, having a complicated plan that may be the wrong plan, is to set specific criteria for how you define success and find a way to measure that, right? So how do you go about doing that? This model is basically like the lean startup model, which I'm a big fan of. What's interesting about this model is this sort of like process where you're going through all these iterations about your product or your idea. And this applies to pretty much everything, right? Whether it's like hardware products or software products. What's interesting about even this slide and about the way this slide is being designed, and actually the person who designed these slides is actually in the room today, so I'm sorry I said that about the slides earlier, is the fact that it puts more emphasis. So you guys can see those circles, ideas, products, and data. If you're talking to like, a startup or technology person, they'll say data, 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 right? If you're talking to a designer, they'll say like products, product. If you talk to a strategist, like ideas is everything, right? The reality is that wider in a smaller circle here is that the process is more important than the result, because the result is always changing. And that's the reason why here I want to highlight the fact that designing, measuring, and learning what you've designed and what you've measured is more important. And when you're able to do that faster than everyone, you'll probably put a product on the market that's better, but ultimately that's more engaging with the actual objective that you've set for your product, right? So it's a very effective way of doing that. And it's a very effective way of emphasizing what's important as you go through designing that product. All right, here's like, this is like kind of the happy, we're all friends type of slide. So this is super, super important. It's probably the hardest thing to do in my presentation. So Frank&Oak has been basically called a technology company. It's been called a retail company. It's been called a fashion company. The hardest thing for our generation, for this moment in time, is the fact that like integration of teams, integration of talent, multidisciplinary approach to anything is the hardest thing to do for companies, for teams, and for individuals. Like for yourself to accept that your role will not just be one role, but will combine multiple disciplines, multiple ways of measuring success. It's probably the single hardest challenge that even for us, like we face. And putting these teams together and aligning them is so challenging, but is one of the only way of creating a product that will touch on all these different points, that will create the kind of like innovative, dynamic products that we're trying to create in this generation, right? So how do we go about that? So one thing about multidisciplinary teams, okay, that is key, is the fact that people get bored fast. People are challenged. So I always say, you know what? We don't agree, so let's just put the product out, right? Let's put the product out, and let's see what the gods or the world will tell us, right? So this is a good way, actually, to put discipline into your process, which is to say we have to ship the product fast. We cannot spend thousands of hours debating on, is it the right thing or is it the wrong thing, right? So What's interesting about Ship Fast is that a lot of people will say, okay, well, this works great when you're a small company, there's 20 people in your company, but what about a company that has like 20,000 people, right? So I would argue that yes, you have to be more careful because there's more at stake. But in some ways, the more careful you are, the more time you take to study an opportunity, the higher the chance of you of missing that opportunity. And market testing, there's nothing like market testing a product, because you will never be able to know what is the impact that the real customer has with your idea unless you put it out in the market, right? So a strategy, as an example, if you are working for a larger company, is to say, well, let's isolate. Let's put the market out fast on the market, but let's isolate to a neighborhood, or let's isolate to a segment of the customer. So one thing at Frank&Oak that we do, as an example, is that we segment our customers a lot. So when we're pushing things out, we don't push it out for everyone. So even we got to that size where ship fast is still important, but you have to make sure quality is also there. So therefore, you focus on a smaller segment in order to test the product that you have on the market, right? So this slide I like a lot because this is actually the first landing page that we designed in that 2.5 weeks. And as you can see, basically we don't have the same logo anymore. We don't have the same colors. So it is okay. You have to let yourself go to say that it is okay to change. It is okay to be wrong, and next year is a new year, and that making those mistakes or not being right about it or evolving what you're doing is your sole purpose, is the reason why you're creating products, the reason why you're in design. So when we changed our initial logo, when we changed our initial design, it was liberating. And I think that now that we're at a new stage, I want to always remind my team that it is okay to be wrong, and it's okay to progress and to create new ideas and put them on the market. All right, so this is about all I had for my presentation. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.